The letter shook in Julian Ashworth's hand before he even finished reading it. He was to be married within the month, not to a woman he had chosen, not to a woman he had even met. He was to marry Alara Whitmore, a name whispered through drawing rooms with a note of pity, a name always followed by the same tired description. Plain, quiet, forgettable. Julian stood in his study at Edenmere with the fire dying behind him, and his jaw locked tight enough to ache. His mother's cousin, Lady Margaret, had delivered the news herself, as if she feared a letter alone would not survive his temper. "The estate cannot survive another season of debt, Julian," she said, folding her hands in her lap as though the matter were already settled. "Lord Whitmore's family has money, and they are willing to overlook the state of our accounts if the match is made quickly. You know what is asked of you." "I know what is asked of me," Julian said. "I am simply not certain I intend to give it." "You have little choice." Margaret's voice softened, but only slightly. "Edenmere has tenants who depend on this house standing. You inherited more than a title when your father died. You inherited every debt that came with it." Julian said nothing. He walked to the window and looked out over the gray stretch of land that had belonged to his family for 6 generations. Every stone of that house, every field, every roof over every tenant's head, rested on his shoulders now. He had known that duty would ask something of him eventually. He simply had not expected it to ask for his entire life in one signature. "They say she is plain," he said finally, not quite meaning to speak the thought aloud. "Does that matter so much to you?" "It matters that I am to spend the rest of my life across a table from a woman I have never seen, never spoken to, and apparently have nothing to look forward to beyond her family's money." His voice had gone flat. The anger burned down to something colder and more bitter. "Forgive me if I do not find that a comforting arrangement." Margaret rose, smoothing her skirts. "Marriage was never meant to be comforting for men in your position, Julian. It is meant to be useful. You will learn to manage." She left him alone with the fire and the letter, and Julian read it a second time, though the words had not changed. A date, a name, a location. Nothing about the woman herself, beyond the same description that had followed her through every conversation he had overheard in the past 2 years. Plain. Unremarkable. A woman society had quietly decided was not worth discussing. He told himself it did not matter. A wife was a duty, like the ledgers and the roof repairs and the endless correspondence with tenants asking for more time to pay their rents. He had learned long ago not to expect warmth from duty. And yet, some small, resentful part of him could not stop turning the unfairness over in his mind. He had once believed he might marry for something more. He had once let himself hope, years ago, before a woman named Charlotte had shown him precisely what came of hoping. She had smiled at him for 2 seasons, let him believe her affection was real, and then married a wealthier man the moment a better offer arrived. Julian had promised himself after that he would never again mistake a smile for sincerity. Perhaps, he told himself now, it was better this way. A plain wife meant no illusions to protect himself from, no charm to distrust, only a contract, signed and sealed, with nothing more expected of either side than duty performed. He almost believed it. That night, Julian found himself unable to sleep. He sat by the fire in his study long after the household had gone quiet, staring at the flames without truly seeing them. Somewhere in the country, a young woman was likely spending this same night, knowing her future had been decided by men in offices who had never once asked what she wanted. He wondered if she resented the arrangement as much as he did, or if she had simply learned, as women in her position often did, that resentment changed nothing. He poured himself a drink he did not finish, and thought again of the description that clung to her name wherever it was spoken. Plain. He had heard the word so often in the past weeks that it had begun to lose its meaning, becoming less a description of a person and more a verdict passed by people who likely knew nothing true about her at all. It struck him, briefly, as unfair. Then he reminded himself that fairness had little to do with duty, and duty was the only thing that mattered now. 2 weeks passed in a blur of solicitors and arrangements. Julian met with Lord Whitmore exactly once. A brief and businesslike conversation in a London office that smelled of ink and old paper. Lord Whitmore was a tired man, older than Julian expected, with the careful politeness of someone managing more worry than he let show. "My daughter is a good woman," Lord Whitmore said, near the end of their meeting, as though sensing Julian's indifference and wishing to correct it. "She deserves better than the way people speak of her." Julian offered a short nod, the kind that ended conversations rather than continued them. "I am certain she does, my lord. I intend to treat her with every courtesy owed a duchess." It was not a promise of affection. Both men understood that. Lord Whitmore's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, but he said nothing further, and the meeting ended with signatures and a date fixed on the calendar. He wrote her exactly one letter before the wedding, a short and formal note expressing his intention to treat her fairly as his wife. Her reply came back within days, her handwriting neat and unhurried, thanking him for his courtesy and expressing a wish that they might build a household of mutual respect. There was nothing warm in the words, but nothing bitter either, and Julian found himself reading the short letter more than once, searching for something between the lines that he could not quite name. Julian did not see Alara Whitmore before the wedding. It was not entirely unusual for matches arranged this quickly, but he found himself faintly irritated by it all the same, as though even this smallest curiosity was being denied him. He asked Margaret once in passing what the girl looked like. "I have not seen her since she was a child," Margaret admitted. "She keeps to the country, quiet sort of girl, from what I hear. Some say she never goes to town at all." "Convenient," Julian muttered, "for a family eager to marry her off without anyone asking too many questions." Margaret gave him a sharp look but did not argue the point. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cold, fitting weather for a match built on obligation rather than affection. Julian dressed in silence, his valet moving efficiently around him, straightening his coat, fixing his collar, saying nothing because there was nothing appropriate to say to a man about to marry a stranger. The church was old, the stone walls holding the chill of 100 winters. Guests filled the pews, drawn more by curiosity than celebration. Julian could feel their eyes on him as he walked to the front, could hear the low murmur of voices speculating on the bride who had not yet appeared. He kept his expression carefully still. Whatever they expected to see on his face, he refused to give it to them. He thought of his father, dead 2 years now, and the weight of the title that had passed to him far too soon. He thought of the tenants whose winter depended on this match succeeding. He thought, briefly and unwillingly, of Charlotte, and the way hope had once cost him more than he cared to remember. Then the doors at the back of the church opened, and the murmuring stopped. Julian did not turn immediately. He had promised himself he would not appear eager, would not give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of watching a duke crane his neck toward a plain bride like a man hoping for better than what he had been given. But the silence in the church had changed in a way he could feel even with his back turned, a shift in the air, as though everyone present had drawn the same breath at once. He turned. A woman walked toward him down the long aisle, veiled in white, her steps steady despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. He could not see her face through the fabric, only the outline of her, tall and composed, moving with a quiet grace that did not match anything he had been told to expect. There was no shuffling nervousness in her walk, no attempt to shrink from the attention. She moved as though she had already decided, long before this morning, exactly how she intended to carry herself through it. Julian's jaw tightened. He told himself it meant nothing, that a confident walk said nothing about the face beneath the veil, that he had built entire arguments in his mind around a description given by people who likely knew nothing true about her at all. Still, something in his chest had gone tight and watchful, an old instinct he could not name stirring awake for the first time in years. She reached him, stopped. Through the veil he thought he could make out the shape of her eyes, steady and fixed on his own, neither pleading nor apologizing for the circumstances that had brought them here. The priest began to speak. Julian barely heard the words. His mind was caught entirely on the woman beside him, on the strange and unwelcome curiosity building beneath his resentment, on the question he had refused to let himself ask until this very moment. Who exactly was he marrying? The vows were spoken. His voice came out steadier than he expected, though his thoughts were anything but calm. Hers, when it came, was quiet but clear, each word measured, betraying nothing of what she might have been feeling standing there beside a man who had made no secret of his indifference to this match. And then the priest gave the final instruction, the one moment Julian had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure without fully admitting it to himself. It was time to lift the veil. His hand rose before he had fully decided to move it, some part of him needing to finally see the truth for himself rather than trust it to rumor any longer. The fabric lifted, and Julian Ashworth, Duke of Edenmere, a man who prided himself on never being caught unprepared, stood utterly still, unable to look away, unable to speak, unable to do anything at all but stare. The church had gone utterly silent. Julian stared at the face beneath the veil, and every assumption he had carried into this marriage collapsed at once. Alara Whitmore was not plain. She was not forgettable. Her eyes were a deep, steady gray, calm in a way that suggested she had long ago learned to guard whatever she truly felt, and her features held a quiet, striking clarity that no rumor had prepared him for. She did not smile at him. She did not look away either. She simply held his gaze, waiting, as though she had expected exactly this reaction and had already decided not to let it move her. Somewhere behind him, Julian heard the faint rustle of guests shifting in their seats, a ripple of surprise moving through the church. He was aware, distantly, that his own stunned silence had lasted a beat too long, that the priest was waiting, that hundreds of eyes were watching a duke who prided himself on composure fail to produce a single word. He recovered himself. Barely. "Alara," he said, because it seemed the only thing left to say, and her name felt strange and unfamiliar in his mouth after weeks of thinking of her only as an obligation. "Your Grace." Her voice was quiet even, giving nothing away. The ceremony continued. Julian moved through the remaining motions with the mechanical calm of a man whose thoughts had scattered entirely, signing where he was told to sign, speaking where he was told to speak, all while the woman beside him remained a puzzle he could not stop turning over. He had built 2 weeks of resentment around a woman who did not exist. The real Elara Whitmore, now Ashworth, Duchess of Edenmere, was someone else entirely, and he had no idea who. The wedding breakfast that followed was a blur of congratulations and curious glances. Julian noticed, more than once, the way guests leaned toward each other to whisper as Elara passed, their earlier certainty about her replaced by open confusion. She bore the attention with the same composure she had shown at the altar, her expression pleasant but distant, revealing nothing of what she might have felt beneath it. He found a moment alone with her near the end of the gathering, the two of them standing slightly apart from the crowd near a tall window overlooking the churchyard. "You did not correct anyone," he said, without preamble. "All this time, people spoke of you as though you were plain, and you let them." Elara turned to look at him fully for the first time since the ceremony. Up close, her composure was even more striking, a stillness that seemed practiced rather than natural, as though she had built it deliberately over years rather than simply possessing it. "Would it have mattered, Your Grace, if I had corrected them?" she asked. "People believe what they wish to believe. I learned long ago that arguing rarely changes a mind already made up." "It might have changed mine," Julian said, and regretted the honesty in it almost immediately. Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quickly for him to name it. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps you would simply have found another reason to resent this marriage. I understand it was not a match you wanted." Julian had no answer for that, because it was true, and he was not yet willing to admit how quickly that particular truth was already beginning to feel less certain. They traveled to Edenmere the following day, the carriage ride long and largely silent. Julian spent most of it looking out the window, uncertain what to say to a wife who was, in every practical sense, still a stranger to him. Elara sat across from him with a small book open in her lap, though he noticed she rarely turned the pages, her attention drifting instead to the passing countryside. "You are quiet," he said eventually, more from discomfort with the silence than any real desire to fill it. "I did not think you wanted conversation," she replied, not unkindly. "You have said very little since the church." "I am not accustomed to having a wife," Julian said. "I confess I am not entirely certain what is expected of me now." A faint, careful smile touched her mouth, the first he had seen from her. "Nor I a husband. Perhaps we might simply be patient with each other, Your Grace, until we understand the shape of this arrangement." It was a reasonable suggestion, practical and unsentimental, exactly the sort of thing Julian would have proposed himself under different circumstances. And yet something in the way she said it, calm and unbothered by the strangeness of their situation, left him more curious about her than he cared to admit. Edenmere greeted them with its usual gray stone solemnity, the household staff lined up in the courtyard to welcome the new Duchess. Julian watched Elara take in the sight of her new home, her expression carefully neutral, though he thought he caught something like relief in the way her shoulders eased slightly once the introductions were finished, and they were finally alone in the entrance hall. "It is a large house," she said. "You will grow accustomed to it," Julian said, "in time." She nodded, but said nothing further, and a servant appeared to show her to the rooms that had been prepared for her, separate from his own, as was proper for a marriage such as theirs. Julian watched her disappear up the staircase and found himself standing alone in the hall longer than necessary, turning over the strange, unsettled feeling that had followed him since the church. Lady Margaret arrived at Edenmere 3 days after the newlyweds, eager to see the household settled and, Julian suspected, equally eager to see for herself the bride who had caused such a stir at the wedding. She found Julian alone in his study going over the estate ledgers and closed the door behind her with the particular briskness she reserved for conversations she considered important. "The whole of London is talking about her," Margaret said without preamble. A duchess more striking than half the debutantes of the season, hidden away in the country for years while everyone repeated the same tired rumor. I confess, Julian, even I am curious how such a thing happened. As am I, Julian admitted. She has not told me, and I have not yet found the right way to ask. Perhaps you ought to try harder. Margaret settled into the chair across from his desk, studying him with the sharp attentiveness of a woman who had known him since childhood, and could read his moods better than most. You look at her strangely, Julian, like a man trying to solve a puzzle he is not certain he wants solved. I look at her like a man who married a stranger and is only now discovering how little he actually knew, Julian said. That is all. Margaret's expression softened, just slightly. Be careful with her. Whatever kept her hidden all these years, it was not nothing. A family does not go to such trouble to bury a daughter's reputation without reason. Julian had considered the same thing more than once in the quiet hours since the wedding, turning it over the way he might, a difficult ledger entry that refused to balance. Someone had shaped the story of Alara Whitmore long before he had ever met her, and he found himself increasingly certain that story had not been shaped by accident. I intend to find out, he said. Gently, Julian, Margaret said, rising to leave. Whatever the reason, I suspect she has carried it long enough without needing a husband who interrogates her over dinner. Her advice stayed with him in the days that followed, tempering the questions he might otherwise have pressed too quickly. Instead, he found himself watching Alara more carefully, learning her in smaller ways, through the details she did not try to hide even as she guarded the larger truths. The days that followed settled into a careful, distant rhythm. Julian and Alara took their meals together, exchanged polite conversation about the household, the weather, the small matters of daily life that required no real intimacy to discuss. He noticed, in those early days, small details about her that did not match the description that had followed her for years. She read constantly, favoring histories and philosophy over the novels most young women of her station preferred. She asked sharp, precise questions about the estate's finances when he mentioned them in passing. Questions that suggested a mind far more capable than anyone had given her credit for. She was quiet, yes, but not from a lack of anything to say. It was, he began to suspect, a quiet chosen deliberately, a shield built for reasons he did not yet understand. He noticed, too, how she treated the household staff, a small thing perhaps, but telling in its own way. She learned the names of every maid and footman within her first days at Edenmere, addressed the cook by name when discussing the week's meals, and once spent nearly an hour speaking quietly with a young maid named Nora, who had come to Alara's rooms in tears over a family matter Julian never learned the details of. He observed the exchange from the hallway without meaning to, struck by the patience in his wife's manner, the way she listened without offering easy comfort, simply present and steady, until the girl's tears had passed. You did not have to trouble yourself with her, Julian said later, when he mentioned it in passing over dinner. She was troubled. I had a few free hours. It seemed a small enough kindness to offer. Alara said it simply, as though the matter required no further explanation, and returned her attention to her plate. It struck Julian, not for the first time, how little her actions matched the woman rumor had described. A plain, unremarkable girl would not command the quiet respect he had already begun to notice among the staff, the way conversations softened when she entered a room, not from fear, as they once had with him alone, but from something closer to genuine regard. One evening, nearly a week after their arrival, Julian found her in the estate's small library, curled into a chair near the window with a book he did not recognize, the last light of evening falling across the pages. You did not tell me you enjoyed reading history, he said, more curious than accusing. Alara looked up, unbothered by the interruption. You did not ask, Your Grace. Fair enough. He crossed the room and glanced at the spine of the book in her hands, a study of ancient governments, dense and academic. Not the sort of reading most guests to his house would have expected of the Duchess rumor had painted as unremarkable. Most women of your station prefer lighter reading, I am told. Most women of my station are not given the credit to prefer anything at all, Alara said, a faint edge entering her voice for the first time since he had known her. People decide what a woman like me should want before she has ever spoken a word for herself. It is easier that way, I think. Easier to imagine me plain and quiet and unremarkable than to wonder what I might actually think. Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting uncomfortably in his chest. He thought of his own assumptions, built entirely on rumor and repeated so many times he had never once questioned them. He thought of the 2 weeks he had spent resenting a woman who did not exist, while the real one sat quietly enduring judgments she had never been given the chance to correct. I believe the same rumors, he admitted. I am not proud of it. Ilara's gaze held his, steady and searching, as though weighing whether his honesty deserved a response. "Most people do," she said finally. "I stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago." There was something in the way she said it, some old weight beneath the words, that told Julian this conversation had touched something deeper than simple gossip. He wanted to ask what had taught her to expect so little from people. What history lay behind the careful walls she kept so precisely maintained? But her expression had already begun to close again, the brief opening sealing itself shut, and he sensed that pushing further tonight would earn him nothing but her retreat. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, rising and setting the book aside. "Julian," he said, before he had fully decided to correct her. "You may call me Julian, if you wish." She paused at the doorway, considering him for a moment. "Good night, Julian," she said finally, and left him alone in the library with the fading light and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that his wife was far more than the world had ever allowed her to be. A carriage Julian did not recognize stood in the drive when he returned from riding the eastern fields, and the sight of it set an immediate, unexplained unease moving through his chest. He handed off his horse to a groom, and crossed the courtyard quickly, his boots loud against the stone. Inside, he found Elara standing rigid in the entrance hall, facing a man Julian had never seen before. The stranger was tall, well-dressed in the manner of a gentleman with money, but little patience for subtlety, his smile too smooth, his eyes moving over Elara with a familiarity that made Julian's jaw tighten before a single word had passed between them. "Julian," Elara said, and something in her voice, a thin thread of tension beneath the careful calm, told him this was not a welcome visitor. "This is Edmund Voss, an acquaintance of my family. Duke Ashworth." Voss offered a bow, unhurried, almost mocking in its politeness. "I had heard the rumors about your bride were exaggerated. I see now they were, if anything, understated. I do not recall inviting you, Mr. Voss," Julian said, his voice level but edged with something colder beneath. "No invitation was necessary, Your Grace. Elara and I are old friends. I simply wished to offer my congratulations in person." Voss's gaze slid back to Elara, lingering in a way that made Julian's hands curl at his sides. "It has been some time, has it not, my dear? Nearly 3 years, I believe, since you left London so suddenly." "Long enough," Elara said, her voice tight. Voss smiled, unbothered by her coldness, and turned back to Julian with the same easy confidence. "You are a fortunate man, Your Grace. Though I confess, I am curious how you came to secure such a match. Her family was not always so eager to see her married." "I fail to see how that concerns you," Julian said. "Perhaps it does not." Voss inclined his head, though his eyes stayed on Elara a moment longer than courtesy required. "I will not trouble you further today. But I do hope we might speak again soon, Elara. There are matters between us that remain unfinished." He left without waiting for a response, his carriage pulling away down the long drive while Julian and Elara stood in silence in the entrance hall, the air between them thick with everything neither of them had said. "Who is he?" Julian asked, once the sound of the carriage had faded. "And what unfinished matters could possibly exist between you?" Elara's composure had not fully returned. Julian watched her hands, usually so still, tighten briefly at her sides, before she forced them to relax. "He is no one of consequence," she said. "A man my father once did business with. I would rather not discuss him further." "Elara." Julian stepped closer, his voice softer now, though the unease had not left him. "You were frightened. I saw it, even if you tried to hide it. I would like to understand why." "It is not something I am prepared to explain," she said, and there was something almost pleading beneath the firmness of her tone, a request for him to let the matter rest that he found himself, despite every instinct urging him to press further, willing to grant. "For now." "Very well," he said. "But if that man returns, I want to know of it immediately. Whatever history exists between you, you are not facing it alone any longer." Something shifted in her expression at that, a flicker of surprise, as though she had not expected him to offer protection so readily. "Thank you," she said quietly, and retreated to her rooms without further explanation, leaving Julian alone with a growing certainty that the rumors surrounding his wife had never been the accident he once assumed. He raised the matter with Margaret that evening, when she called at Edenmere for supper, describing Voss's visit and the fear he had seen, however briefly, cross Elara's face. "Edmund Voss," Margaret repeated, frowning as she searched her memory. "I have heard the name. Not a man of the best reputation, from what little I recall. There were whispers, years ago, of debts, and of a young woman his family hoped he might marry for her fortune, before the arrangement fell apart under strange circumstances." "Elara," Julian said, the pieces beginning to settle into an uncomfortable shape. I could not say for certain, Margaret admitted, but it would explain a great deal, would it not? A family suddenly eager to hide their daughter away in the country, to let rumor paint her as plain and unremarkable, rather than risk drawing further attention her way. If Voss once pursued her, and the family wished to be rid of him, disappearing from society's notice would be one of the surest ways to manage it. Julian sat with that thought long after Margaret had gone, turning it over with the same careful attention he gave the estate's most difficult accounts. If Margaret's suspicion was correct, then everything he had believed about his wife's plainness, every rumor that had shaped his resentment before their wedding, had been a deliberate shield built to protect her from a man who refused to let her go. It reframed the entire marriage in his mind, and reframed, too, the quiet strength he had already begun to admire in her, the composure she wore like armor, because she had needed armor for years before he had ever entered her life. He found Alara in the garden the following morning, sitting alone on a stone bench near the roses, her attention fixed somewhere beyond the hedges, lost in thoughts she did not share. "I spoke with Margaret last night," Julian said, settling beside her. "She mentioned Edmund Voss, debts, a broken arrangement, years ago." Alara's hands stilled in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Julian waited, unwilling to press further than her silence allowed. "He wanted to marry me," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, as though she had rehearsed the confession many times without ever finding the courage to speak it aloud. "3 years ago, my father was struggling then, more than anyone outside our household knew, and Voss offered to settle every debt in exchange for my hand. I refused him. Why? Because even at 17 I understood exactly what kind of man he was," Alara said, a hardness entering her voice that Julian had not heard from her before. "He did not want a wife. He wanted control, and the appearance of respectability money alone could not buy him. I saw the way he spoke to servants, to anyone he believed beneath him. I would rather have watched my family lose everything than spend my life under that man's hand." "What happened?" "My father agreed with me in the end, though it cost him greatly to refuse the arrangement. Voss did not take the rejection well. He made certain, in the months that followed, that anyone who might have considered courting me heard only the worst versions of who I was. It was easier, I think, to let the rumors grow than to fight a battle we could not win outright. If society believed me plain and unremarkable, Voss would have no reason to pursue the match further, and no other man would think to look my way either. My father hoped, eventually, that Voss would lose interest entirely. But he has not," Julian said, the truth of it settling heavy in his chest. "No," Alara said, "he has not. I do not know why he has resurfaced now, after so long, but I do not believe his visit yesterday was accidental, and I do not believe it will be his last." Julian studied her profile in the morning light, the careful composure she had worn since the day he met her, now recognizable for exactly what it was. Not coldness, not indifference, but a survival she had built for herself out of necessity, brick by careful brick, because no one else had been willing to build it for her. "You should have told me sooner," he said, though there was no accusation in it, only a quiet regret that he had spent so many days assuming the worst of a woman who had simply been protecting herself the only way she knew how. "I did not know if I could trust you," Alara admitted. "You did not want this marriage, Julian. I had no reason to believe you would want to carry my burdens along with it. I want to understand you," he said, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "Whatever burdens come with that, I find I would rather know them than continue living beside a stranger." Alara turned to look at him fully, something unguarded passing briefly across her expression before the old caution returned, softer now, but still present. "That is more than most men would offer," she said quietly. "Then perhaps," Julian said, "it is time someone did." They sat together in the garden a while longer, the silence between them different now, less the distance of strangers, and more the quiet of two people beginning, carefully, to trust each other with the truth. But even as Julian allowed himself that small comfort, he could not shake the unease Voss's visit had left behind, nor the certainty that a man who had spent 3 years shaping rumors to control a woman he could not have, would not simply walk away now that he had found her again. That afternoon, Julian rode into the nearby town alone, seeking out his solicitor, a careful, thorough man named Mr. Pratt who had handled the Ashworth family's affairs for over a decade. Julian asked him, without offering much explanation, to make quiet inquiries into Edmund Voss's financial standing and recent activities. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" Pratt asked, though he was already reaching for paper to note the request. "A man visited my wife yesterday, uninvited, and left her badly shaken," Julian said. "I would like to know precisely what kind of man he is before he decides to visit again." Pratt promised to have what information he could gather within the week, and Julian returned to Edenmere with little comfort beyond the knowledge that he was, at least, no longer standing entirely blind against whatever threat Voss represented. On his way home, Julian stopped briefly at the small church where he and Alara had been married, and found himself speaking with the same priest who had presided over their vows. The old man remembered him well, and when Julian mentioned, carefully and without much detail, that a difficult man from his wife's past had resurfaced, the priest offered a piece of advice that stayed with Julian the rest of the ride home. "Men who build their power on secrets and fear rarely survive the light, Your Grace," the priest said. "The kindest thing you can do for your wife is remind her that she no longer has to carry her fear alone. Fear loses most of its strength the moment it is shared." Julian turned the words over for the remainder of the journey, and though he was not a man given easily to sentiment, he found there was a plain truth in them that matched exactly what he had begun to feel toward Alara since the garden conversation. Whatever Voss believed he still held over her, Julian intended to make certain the man discovered, soon and unmistakably, that Alara Whitmore no longer stood alone. The answer came sooner than expected, delivered not by Pratt, but by a letter addressed to Alara herself, which arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider Julian did not recognize. He found her in the drawing room, the letter open in her lap, her face drained of color. "What does it say?" he asked, crossing the room quickly. She handed it to him without a word. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that suggested a man who took great care in everything he did, including the quiet cruelty folded into every line. Voss wrote of old debts he claimed her father still owed him, debts he suggested could be quietly resolved if Alara agreed to meet with him privately, alone, away from her husband's watchful presence. The tone was polite, almost friendly, which somehow made the implication beneath it more unsettling than an open threat would have been. "He wrote you at your husband's home," Julian said, his voice low with barely restrained anger, "requesting a private meeting, as though I would simply permit such a thing." "He does not care whether you permit it," Alara said. "That has never been how Voss operates. He finds the crack in every situation and presses until it breaks. My father's debts, my reputation, now perhaps threats against this household if I refuse him outright." "There is no debt," Julian said. "Whatever your father may have owed him, if anything at all, it ends now. I will see to it myself." "You cannot simply make a man like Voss disappear, Julian. I have watched him work for years. He is patient. He is careful, and he does not accept losing gracefully." Julian folded the letter and set it aside, forcing his voice into something calmer than he felt. "Then we will be patient and careful as well. But you will not face him alone, and you will not meet him in secret. Whatever he wants, he will have to say it to both of us, in the open, where he cannot twist the truth to suit himself." Alara studied him for a long moment, something like gratitude softening the tension in her shoulders. "You did not have to involve yourself in this," she said. "It would have been simpler for you to let me manage it alone." "Simpler, perhaps," Julian said, "but not right. Whatever else this marriage began as, Alara, you are my wife now. Voss's quarrel with you is a quarrel with this house, and I do not intend to let him believe otherwise." Later that evening, once the household had quieted and Alara had retired, Julian found himself again in his study. The letter from Voss spread across his desk beside Pratt's initial notes, which had arrived that same afternoon. The picture forming was not a comforting one. Voss's finances, once considerable, had thinned significantly over the past 2 years, his debts mounting in quiet corners of London that few outside financial circles would have noticed. A man like that, desperate and prideful in equal measure, was far more dangerous than one simply cruel. Desperation made men reckless, and reckless men rarely calculated the cost of what they were willing to do to secure what they believed they were owed. Julian did not sleep well that night, his mind circling the same unanswered question. What, precisely, was Edmund Voss willing to risk to have what he believed should have been his 3 years ago? He rose before dawn and walked the length of the Eastern Gallery, past portraits of dukes and duchesses who had faced their own quiet battles long before him, and found Alara already awake, standing at the tall window that overlooked the drive, as though half expecting to see another unwelcome carriage approaching. "You could not sleep either," he said. "I have not slept well in 3 days," she admitted, "not since he came here." Julian came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough to feel the tension still coiled tight beneath her stillness. "We will not let him take anything further from you," he said. "Not your peace, not your safety, not this house. Whatever it costs, I intend to see this settled properly, and soon." Alara did not answer immediately, but she did not step away from him either, and in the pale gray light of early morning, something quiet and unspoken passed between them, a fragile beginning of trust neither was yet ready to name aloud. Mr. Pratt returned to Edenmere sooner than expected, his expression grave as he was shown into Julian's study. "Your Grace," he said, laying a folder of documents across the desk, "I believe you will want to see this before we discuss anything further." Julian opened the folder, and the shape of Edmund Voss's true circumstances laid itself out before him in careful, damning detail. Debts far beyond what Julian had suspected, 2 failed business ventures in the past year alone, and, most troubling of all, a pattern of behavior toward at least 2 other women whose families had quietly paid Voss to disappear from their daughters' lives, after similar campaigns of rumor and pressure. "He has done this before," Julian said, the words landing heavy in the quiet room. "More than once, Your Grace. It appears to be something of a method for him. He targets young women whose families have wealth but limited standing to fight back publicly, builds pressure through reputation and quiet threats, and extracts payment or advantage before the family finds the resolve to expose him. Most choose silence over scandal. It has served him well, until now." Julian sat back, the pieces of the past weeks arranging themselves into a picture uglier than he had imagined. It was not simply desperation driving Voss's return. It was habit. A practiced, deliberate cruelty he had refined over years, preying on women society had already taught to expect too little protection. "Thank you, Pratt," Julian said. "This will be useful." Once the solicitor had gone, Julian sat alone with the documents for a long while, anger settling into something colder and more purposeful than the hot temper that had first flared the day Voss appeared uninvited in his home. He thought of Alara at 17, refusing a man twice her equal in cunning, protecting her family the only way she could by disappearing behind a rumor of plainness that had followed her for 3 long years. He thought of how easily society had accepted that rumor, how readily his own mind had accepted it too, without ever once questioning who might have benefited from a young woman being erased so completely from notice. He found Alara in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own since arriving at Edenmere, a fire burning low against the evening chill. "I know now what Voss has done," Julian said, setting the folder before her. "Not only to you, to others as well." Alara's hand stilled over the letter she had been writing. She read through the document slowly, her expression tightening with each page, though Julian noticed she did not seem entirely surprised by what she found. "I suspected as much," she said finally. "He was too practiced, even 3 years ago, for it to have been his first attempt at such a scheme. Why did no one stop him sooner?" "Because the families he targets have more to lose from scandal than he does," Alara said. "A ruined reputation follows a woman far longer than it follows a man in his position. My father understood that better than anyone. He chose to protect me quietly rather than risk a public fight that might have cost us everything regardless of the outcome." Julian studied her, something clarifying in his mind that had been building since the garden, since the letter, since the moment her veil had first lifted and revealed a woman entirely unlike the one he had expected to marry. "That ends now," he said. "I do not intend to let Voss believe silence will continue to protect him." "What do you mean to do?" "I mean to expose him," Julian said, "publicly and thoroughly, with every piece of evidence Pratt has gathered. A man who has built his advantage on secrecy loses everything the moment the truth becomes impossible to ignore." Ilara's expression flickered with something between hope and fear. "It will not be simple, Julian. Men like Voss do not surrender quietly. If you move against him openly, he may retaliate in ways neither of us can predict." "I am aware of the risk," Julian said, "but I would rather face it directly than watch you continue living in fear of a man who has already taken enough from you." Julian also wrote, that same week, to Lord Whitmore directly, informing him of everything Pratt had uncovered, and of the plan taking shape to expose Voss once and for all. The reply arrived within days, shorter than Julian expected but heavy with feeling. "I should have fought harder for her 3 years ago," Lord Whitmore wrote. "I told myself silence was the safer path, that protecting her name quietly was wiser than risking a public battle we might have lost. I see now that silence cost her more than any scandal might have. Thank you, Your Grace, for finishing what I lacked the courage to begin." Julian read the letter twice before setting it aside, understanding, more fully than before, the quiet guilt that had likely shaped every choice Lord Whitmore had made on his daughter's behalf. It was not cowardice exactly that had driven the man to hide Alara behind a curtain of rumor. It was fear. The ordinary fear of a father without the power to protect his child through any means beyond the ones available to him at the time. Julian intended to succeed where that fear had once limited what was possible. The following days passed in careful preparation. Julian met again with Pratt, gathering additional statements from the other families Voss had targeted. Families who, once assured of Julian's discretion and the weight of a duke's protection standing behind them, proved more willing to speak than Pratt had initially expected. It seemed, Julian realized, that many had simply been waiting for someone with enough standing and resolve to finally challenge Voss's reputation before them. One of the women Pratt located was a widow named Lady Iris Colton, whose younger sister had been targeted by Voss 2 years earlier under nearly identical circumstances. She arrived at Edenmere at Julian's invitation, cautious at first, clearly unaccustomed to anyone taking her family's ordeal seriously. "My sister has never fully recovered from what he did to her name," Lady Colton said, seated stiffly across from Julian and Ilara in the drawing room. "She married eventually, a good man who did not care for gossip, but she still will not attend gatherings where she fears Voss might appear. I confess, Your Grace, I did not expect anyone of your standing to take an interest in setting the matter right." "I have every interest in it," Julian said. "My wife faced the same man, the same methods, and very nearly the same fate your sister endured. I do not intend to let him continue unchecked simply because exposing him is inconvenient." Lady Colton's gaze moved to Ilara, softening with an understanding only someone who had witnessed the same cruelty firsthand could offer. "Then you have my full support, Your Grace, and my sister's testimony as well, if you require it. It is long past time someone put a stop to him." By the end of the week, Pratt had gathered statements from 3 separate families, each account echoing the same pattern of manufactured rumor and quiet financial pressure. Julian found the consistency of it almost more disturbing than any single story alone. Voss had refined his approach over years, learning precisely how far he could push before a family's fear of scandal outweighed their willingness to fight back. Margaret, once informed of the full situation, threw her considerable social influence behind the effort as well, quietly arranging for the right people to hear the right rumors at the right moments, ensuring that by the time Julian made any formal move, London society would already be primed to believe it. "You have made more enemies for Voss in a week than he has made friends in years," Margaret told Julian one evening, with something like satisfaction in her voice. "He will not enjoy discovering how quickly the ground has shifted beneath him." Ilara, throughout the preparations, remained quieter than usual, watching the unfolding effort with an expression Julian could not entirely read. He found her one evening in the garden again, the same bench near the roses where she had first told him the truth about Voss. "You are troubled," he said, sitting beside her. "I have spent 3 years believing I had to manage this alone," Ilara said. "It is strange, watching you and Margaret move so quickly to end what I had resigned myself to enduring indefinitely. I do not yet know how to trust that it will simply be over." "It may not be over immediately," Julian admitted, "but it will end, Ilara. I intend to make certain of that." She turned to look at him, the careful composure she wore so consistently softening into something rawer, more uncertain. "Why does this matter so much to you? A month ago you resented this marriage entirely. Now you risk your own standing to protect a woman you barely know." Julian considered the question honestly before answering. "I did resent it," he said. "I will not pretend otherwise. But the woman I resented marrying does not exist, Ilara. She was never real. The woman across from me now, the one who refused a man twice her equal rather than surrender to his control, who endured years of quiet cruelty without ever losing the steadiness I have come to admire in her. That woman deserves far more than my resentment. She deserves protection. She deserves the truth told plainly, without fear." Ilara said nothing for a long moment, her eyes bright in the fading evening light. "No one has spoken of me that way before," she said quietly. "Not even my own father, though I know he loved me." "Then perhaps it is time someone did," Julian said, echoing the words he had offered her days before in that same garden, and this time, when Ilara's hand found his on the stone bench between them, she did not pull away, and neither did he. Word of Julian's inquiries reached Voss faster than either of them expected. 2 days after Lady Colton's visit, Pratt arrived at Edenmere with news that Voss had been seen at his club in London, agitated and demanding to know who had been asking questions about his finances and his past dealings with young women of standing. He had, according to Pratt's sources, left the club abruptly after being pressed on the matter, and had not been seen publicly since. "He knows," Julian said. "He suspects, at the very least," Pratt agreed. "A man like Voss survives on control, Your Grace. The moment he senses that control slipping, He tends to grow reckless rather than cautious. I would advise increased care around the household until this matter is settled. Julian took the warning seriously, instructing the household staff to report any unfamiliar visitors or activity near the estate immediately, and arranging for 2 additional grooms to keep watch over the grounds after dark. Elara, when informed of the precautions, said little, though Julian noticed the familiar tension returning to her shoulders, the wariness she had only recently begun to set aside creeping back into her posture. "I do not wish to frighten you further," Julian said, finding her once more near the garden that evening, "but I would rather you be cautious than caught unprepared." "I have spent 3 years being cautious," Elara said. "I am no stranger to watching the edges of a room for a threat I cannot always see. I only hoped, foolishly perhaps, that marrying you might finally put an end to that particular habit." "It will," Julian said, with more certainty than he entirely felt. "Soon, I promise you that." They sat together as the sky darkened fully overhead, the quiet between them no longer strained by distance or suspicion, but something new entirely, fragile and unspoken, growing steadily in the space where resentment had once lived. Julian knew the fight ahead would not be simple. Voss would not surrender his advantage without a struggle, and whatever came next would test both of them in ways neither could yet predict. But for the first time since the wedding, Julian found himself certain of one thing beyond any doubt. He did not intend to face what came next as a man burdened by duty alone. He intended to face it as a man determined to protect a woman who had already survived far more than she should ever have had to, and who deserved, at last, a future built on something sturdier than fear. 3 days had passed since Pratt's warning about Voss's growing desperation, 3 days in which the household had settled into a careful, watchful calm. Julian had begun to believe, cautiously, that the increased precautions around Edenmere might be enough to deter the man entirely, that Voss, faced with mounting evidence and a duke's full resolve arrayed against him, might simply choose to disappear, rather than risk further exposure. He was wrong, and he would spend the rest of that night understanding exactly how wrong he had been. That afternoon, Elara had walked the garden alone for the first time since Voss's initial visit, the roses in full bloom and the day unusually warm, and Julian, occupied with a final review of Pratt's evidence in preparation for a formal complaint to the magistrate, had not thought to accompany her. It was a small, ordinary choice, the kind made 100 times without consequence in an ordinary week. That evening, it would haunt him more than he cared to admit. The scream tore through the quiet of the evening before Julian even understood what he was hearing. He was in his study, reviewing the final statements Pratt had gathered, when Nora burst through the door without knocking, her face white with panic. "Your Grace, the Duchess. She is not in her rooms, and one of the garden gates has been forced open. I found it swinging loose when I went to close the shutters." Julian was moving before she finished speaking, out through the hall and into the darkening garden, his heart pounding with a fear sharper than any he had known since his father's death. The gate she mentioned stood exactly as described, its lock broken, the metal bent as though forced with deliberate strength. Beyond it, the path led toward the tree line at the edge of the estate, and in the fading light, Julian caught the faint impression of 2 sets of footprints pressed into the soft earth, one clearly Elara's, the other far heavier, dragging in places where hers did not. "Wake the grooms," Julian said to Nora, his voice steady despite the roaring panic beneath it. "Send one to town for the magistrate. The rest come with me." He did not wait for the household to fully rouse itself before setting off along the path, a lantern snatched from the wall, and his heart hammering with every step. He knew, with a certainty that turned his blood cold, exactly who had done this. Voss had grown reckless, exactly as Pratt warned he might, and had chosen the one act guaranteed to destroy Julian entirely before any public exposure could ruin him first. The footprints led through the tree line and toward the old hunting lodge at the edge of Edenmere's land, a structure long fallen into disuse, isolated enough that a man might hide there for days without detection. Julian's chest tightened at the sight of a faint light flickering behind one shuttered window as he approached, the 2 grooms who had followed him falling silent at his signal. He crept close enough to hear voices through the gap in the shutters, Voss's low and controlled, Elara's sharp with a fury that steadied Julian's nerves even through his fear. She was not broken, she was not weeping or pleading. She was fighting, exactly as she had fought 3 years ago when this same man first tried to claim her. "You cannot keep me here," Elara's voice carried clearly through the gap. "Julian will find me. He will not stop until he does." "By the time he finds you," Voss said, an oily calm beneath the words, "it will not matter what he intends. A duchess discovered alone with another man, her reputation beyond saving regardless of the truth. You will have no choice but to set the marriage aside, and you, my dear, will finally understand that refusing me 3 years ago accomplished nothing beyond delaying the inevitable. You are a fool if you believe reputation matters more to him than the truth, Alara said. You never understood him at all. Julian had heard enough. He signaled the grooms into position at the rear of the lodge and moved to the front door himself, testing the handle with careful silence before throwing his full weight against it. The old wood gave way easily, splintering inward, and Julian stepped into the dim room with every instinct focused entirely on the sight before him. Alara stood near the far wall, her hands bound but her chin lifted, unbroken despite everything. Voss spun toward the door, his composure cracking the moment he registered exactly who had arrived. Ashworth, Voss said, reaching for something at his belt, though Julian was already closing the distance between them before the man's hand fully closed around whatever weapon he carried. The struggle that followed was brief and brutal, more instinct than strategy, Julian's fear for Alara sharpening every movement into something faster and more decisive than Voss anticipated from a man he had underestimated as soft, protected by title rather than any real capability. Julian pinned him against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from Voss's lungs, and held him there, unmoving, until the grooms arrived to secure him properly. You will hang for this, Julian said, low and furious, close enough that only Voss could hear the words clearly. Not merely lose your standing, hang. I will see to it personally. Voss said nothing, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the pale, hollow look of a man who had finally miscalculated beyond any recovery. Julian turned from him immediately, crossing to Alara and working quickly at the bindings around her wrists, his hands unsteady in a way they rarely were, undone entirely by the fear that had chased him through the darkening garden and along the forest path. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rougher than he intended. No, Alara said, though her own hands trembled now that the danger had passed, the composure she had held so fiercely in Voss's presence finally beginning to crack. He grabbed me near the roses. I fought him as long as I could. I know, Julian said. I heard you, through the window. You were magnificent. Something in her expression broke fully at that, the tears she had refused to shed in front of Voss finally spilling free, and Julian pulled her against him without hesitation, holding her while the grooms led Voss away in restraints toward the house, toward the magistrate who would soon arrive to take him into proper custody. I thought, Alara said against his shoulder, her voice muffled and unsteady, that he might finally succeed where he failed before. I thought I might lose everything I had only just begun to have. You lost nothing, Julian said, one hand moving gently over her hair, the other still holding her close, unwilling entirely to let go. I am here. You are safe. Whatever he intended, it ends tonight. They walked back to Edenmere together in the deepening dark, Alara's hand held tightly in his, the household staff gathering anxiously in the courtyard as they approached, relief washing visibly over every face at the sight of the Duchess returned safely. Margaret arrived within the hour, summoned by an urgent messenger, and took charge of settling the household while the magistrate arrived to formally take Voss into custody. Pratt's carefully gathered evidence proving more than sufficient to ensure the man would face full consequences for both the kidnapping and the years of manipulation that preceded it. The magistrate, a stern, methodical man named Sir Walter Price, arrived within the hour and took Julian's account alongside Alara's with careful precision, cross-checking every detail against the evidence Pratt had already gathered over the preceding week. Voss, held under guard in one of the estate's outbuildings until he could be properly transported, offered no defense beyond a series of increasingly desperate denials that grew thinner with every question Price asked. The evidence against him is substantial, Your Grace, Price said, once the initial questioning had concluded. Between tonight's events and the testimony already gathered from the other families he targeted, I do not believe he will escape full consequence this time. Men of his sort rely on families too frightened or too proud to press charges publicly. You have given him no such shelter. Good, Julian said. He has hidden behind other people's silence for years. That ends tonight. Price departed with Voss in restrained custody before midnight, promising a swift and thorough prosecution, and Margaret, who had stayed to oversee the household through the chaos, finally allowed herself to embrace Alara properly, once the immediate danger had passed. You are a braver woman than most I have known, Margaret said, holding Alara by the shoulders and studying her with unmistakable pride. I confess, when Julian first told me of this marriage, I worried he had been given a burden rather than a match. I see now precisely how wrong that worry was. Elara managed a tired, grateful smile, though the exhaustion of the evening had clearly begun to settle over her fully now that the danger had passed. Margaret, sensing it, ushered the remaining staff toward their duties, and left Julian and Elara finally, mercifully alone. It was well past midnight before Julian and Elara finally found a quiet moment alone, seated together near the fire in her sitting room, the events of the evening still raw between them. "I am sorry," Elara said quietly, staring into the flames. "You married a woman you barely knew, and within a matter of weeks, you have been dragged into danger and scandal neither of us chose." "Do not apologize," Julian said, firm enough that she looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. "None of this was your doing, Elara. You did nothing but survive a man determined to destroy you, and you did it with more courage than I have seen from anyone in my life. If anything, I owe you an apology for every assumption I carried into this marriage before I ever truly knew you. You have more than made up for that," Elara said softly. Julian reached for her hand, holding it carefully between both of his own. "I did not expect, when this marriage began, to feel anything beyond duty toward the woman I married," he said. "I was wrong. Tonight, standing outside that lodge, hearing your voice through the window, I understood exactly how wrong I had been. I do not merely feel duty toward you, Elara. I have not, for some time now." He thought briefly, of Charlotte, of the years he had spent guarding himself against exactly this kind of feeling, certain that affection given freely only ever ended in betrayal. Charlotte had smiled at him for 2 seasons and left the moment a wealthier offer arrived, and Julian had built a wall around himself in the aftermath, certain that duty without hope was safer than hope that might one day be broken again. Elara had not asked for his hope. She had not schemed for his affection, or performed a version of herself designed to win his favor. She had simply endured, quietly and fiercely, exactly who she was, even when the whole of society decided that person was worth nothing at all. It was, Julian understood now, an entirely different kind of courage than anything Charlotte had ever shown him, and it had undone every wall he thought he had built to protect himself. "I loved someone once," he said, the confession costing him more than he expected, though he found he wanted her to know it, wanted no more secrets standing between them after everything the night had already stripped away. She left the moment something better arrived. "I told myself afterward that I would never again mistake a smile for sincerity, that duty was safer than hope. I did not expect to find both in the same person." Elara's hand tightened around his. "I am not her," she said quietly. "No," Julian said. "You are not. You are someone far braver, and I very nearly let 3 weeks of resentment blind me to it entirely." Elara's breath caught, her eyes searching his in the firelight, uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. "What do you feel then?" "Everything," Julian said simply, "that I once believed I would never allow myself to feel again." She did not answer with words. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, and Julian held her there long into the night, the fire burning low, the danger finally past, and something new and fragile and entirely unexpected settling quietly into place between them. Morning came gray and quiet over Edenmere, the household still settling from the disturbance of the night before, though a different kind of calm had taken hold of the two people at its center. Julian found Elara already awake when he came to her door, seated near the window with a cup of tea untouched beside her, her eyes distant with thoughts he could no longer easily guess. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Lighter," she admitted, seeming almost surprised by the word herself. "I have carried the fear of him for 3 years, Julian. I did not fully understand how heavy that weight had become until last night, when it was finally lifted from me." "It is not entirely lifted yet," Julian said gently. "There is still the matter of his trial and whatever comes after, but you will not face any of it without me beside you. That much I promise you completely." Elara reached for his hand across the small table between them, her fingers steady now in a way they had not been the night before. "Then I find I am not so afraid of what comes next," she said, "as long as you remain exactly where you are." "I intend to," Julian said, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in his life before this strange, unexpected marriage had shown him precisely what he had been missing. The trial of Edmund Voss became the talk of London before the first witness had even taken the stand. Julian had expected scrutiny, but the scale of public attention still surprised him. Word of a duke's wife kidnapped by a man with a long history of manipulating young women spread quickly through drawing rooms and clubs alike. and by the time the proceedings began, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the downfall of a man many had once considered merely disreputable, rather than genuinely dangerous. Ilara insisted on attending every session, despite Julian's initial concern that the public exposure might prove too difficult for her to bear. She sat beside him each day, composed and unflinching, her testimony delivered with the same steady clarity that had first caught his attention across a garden bench weeks earlier. "He built his power on the assumption that women like me would rather stay silent than be seen," she told the court, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "I intend to prove him wrong, in the open, where everyone can hear it." Lady Colton's sister testified as well, along with a third woman Pratt had located in the final days before the trial, each account reinforcing the same pattern of calculated cruelty that had defined years of Voss's conduct. The evidence, combined with the events at the hunting lodge, left little room for doubt. Voss was convicted within the week, sentenced to transportation, his name and reputation destroyed as thoroughly as he had once attempted to destroy Ilara's. Julian watched him led from the courtroom in restraints, expecting some final flare of satisfaction at the sight, but found instead only a quiet, settled relief. The fear that had shadowed Ilara for 3 years no longer had a face to answer to. That, more than any punishment handed down by the court, felt like the true resolution. Lord Whitmore had traveled from the country to attend the final day of proceedings, arriving just in time to hear the verdict read aloud. Julian watched the older man's shoulders sag with a relief so complete it seemed to age him 10 years in an instant, the quiet guilt he had carried since first choosing silence over confrontation finally beginning to lift. "I should have done this myself. Years ago," Lord Whitmore said to Julian afterward, his voice unsteady. "I told myself I was protecting her. I see now. I was only delaying what needed to be done, and leaving her to carry the burden of my caution." "You did what you believed possible at the time," Julian said. "Not every father has a duke's resources standing behind him. I do not think Ilara blames you for the choices you made trying to protect her." Lord Whitmore's eyes found his daughter across the courtroom, where she stood speaking quietly with Lady Colton, both women visibly lighter now that the trial had reached its end. "No," he admitted, "I do not think she does. But I intend to tell her regardless how deeply I regret not fighting harder for her sooner." He crossed the room to her, and Julian watched from a respectful distance as father and daughter embraced, years of unspoken guilt and quiet endurance finally finding their release in a single tearful moment neither seemed inclined to rush. Society's reaction to the trial proved swifter and more complete than either of them expected. The rumors that had once painted Ilara as plain and unremarkable evaporated entirely, replaced by open admiration for the composure and courage she had shown throughout the ordeal. Invitations began arriving at Edenmere within days, hostesses eager to claim the now celebrated Duchess for their gatherings. The same women who had once repeated tired gossip about her now speaking her name with something closer to reverence. Julian found himself, more than once in those following weeks, standing at social gatherings and watching his wife move through rooms that had once dismissed her entirely, now drawn to her with genuine interest. She handled the sudden attention with the same measured grace she brought to everything else, neither seeking it out nor shrinking from it, simply allowing herself, for the first time in years, to be seen fully for who she actually was. Nora, the young maid whose quiet tears Ilara had once tended with such patience, approached the Duchess shyly one afternoon shortly after the family's return to Edenmere, holding a small, carefully wrapped parcel. "I heard everything that happened, Your Grace," Nora said, her cheeks coloring slightly. "The whole household did. I wanted you to know how proud we all are, watching you stand against him the way you did. I made this for you, if you would accept it." Ilara unwrapped the parcel to find a small embroidered handkerchief, delicately stitched with a border of roses that clearly echoed the garden where so much of the past months had unfolded. She held it carefully, visibly moved by the gesture. "Thank you, Nora," Ilara said. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "You were kind to me when I needed it most," Nora said simply. It seemed only right to return the kindness, however small. Julian, observing the exchange from across the room, felt something settle further into place within him, a quiet confirmation of everything he had come to understand about his wife over the preceding weeks. Ilara's strength had never been loud or performative. It had always been this, small and steady and generous, offered freely to anyone who needed it, regardless of what she herself was enduring at the time. At a grand ball hosted by Margaret several weeks after the trial's conclusion, meant in part to formally reintroduce the Duke and Duchess of Edenmere to society, under far different circumstances than their wedding had allowed, Julian found himself approached by an older gentleman he vaguely recognized from his father's era, a man known for his blunt opinions and little patience for pretense. "I confess, Ashworth, I did not expect much from the match when I first heard of it," the man said, watching Alara across the room as she spoke easily with a cluster of admiring guests. "Plain girl," they said. "Convenient arrangement, nothing more." "I see now how thoroughly wrong that assessment was." "As did I for a time," Julian admitted. "It was never her that was lacking, only the willingness of others to see her clearly." The old gentleman studied him for a moment, something approving in his expression. "A fine thing, to admit such an error rather than simply enjoy the outcome without acknowledging the mistake. Your father would be proud, I think, to see the man you have become." Margaret found him not long after, a satisfied smile playing at her mouth as she surveyed the crowded ballroom. "I believe this is the finest gathering I have hosted in years," she said. "Half of London wishes to be seen speaking with your wife tonight. It is a remarkable thing, Julian, watching a woman finally claim the place she always deserved." "She did not need the ball to claim it," Julian said. "She has always deserved it. Society simply required time to notice." "Perhaps," Margaret agreed, "though I confess, I take a certain satisfaction in watching the very people who once dismissed her now competing for her attention. There is a particular justice in it." Julian found himself smiling at that, a rare, easy expression that felt unfamiliar after so many months of tension and careful vigilance. "I will not deny finding some satisfaction in it myself," he admitted. He excused himself from Margaret's company and made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and pleasantries from guests he barely knew. His attention fixed the entire time on the woman across the room whose laughter, light and genuine, carried faintly over the music each time he caught sight of her. Julian carried those words with him for the rest of the evening, finding Alara near the edge of the ballroom during a brief lull in the festivities, the music swelling softly behind them. "You look thoughtful," she said, studying his expression. "I am thinking of how differently this evening might have gone, had your veil never lifted, had I continued believing every rumor I was given without question," Julian said. "I very nearly missed knowing you entirely, Alara. That thought troubles me more than I expected it would." "But you did not miss it," Alara said, taking his hand. "Whatever nearly happened does not matter half so much as what actually did." He drew her closer, the ballroom around them fading into background noise as he looked at the woman who had, in the space of a few short months, transformed an arrangement built entirely on duty into something he no longer recognized as anything less than devotion. "I owe you an apology I do not believe I have properly given," Julian said, "not merely for the assumptions I carried into our marriage, but for the resentment I let color our first weeks together. You deserved better than a husband who judged you before ever truly knowing you." "You have more than made amends," Alara said softly. "You stood beside me when it mattered most. You believed me, defended me, and refused to let the world continue erasing who I actually am. Whatever came before that no longer troubles me, Julian. I would rather remember who you became than who you once were." "Then let me become more still," Julian said. "Let me spend whatever years remain to us, proving that the man who once resented this marriage is entirely gone, replaced by one who considers you the finest thing to ever come into his life, however unexpectedly it began." Alara's eyes shone in the ballroom's soft light, and for the first time since Julian had known her, the careful composure she wore so consistently gave way entirely to something unguarded and warm. "Then perhaps," she said, "we might finally stop calling this a marriage of convenience, and simply call it what it has become." "And what is that?" Julian asked, though he already suspected the answer, already felt it settling in his own chest with a certainty that surprised him after years of guarding against exactly this kind of feeling. "A marriage of choice," Alara said. "Whatever circumstance brought us together, Julian, I choose this now. I choose you, fully and without reservation." Nearby, Lady Colton caught sight of the two of them together and approached briefly, her expression warm with genuine happiness. "I wish to thank you both again before the evening ends," she said. "My sister wrote to me this week. She attended a gathering in London for the first time in 2 years, without fear of encountering him there. I do not believe I can properly express what that freedom means to our family." "You owe us no thanks," Alara said. "You gave your testimony without hesitation, when you might easily have chosen silence instead. That courage mattered as much as anything Julian or I contributed." Lady Colton smiled, inclining her head before excusing herself back into the crowd, and Julian watched Alara's gaze follow her for a moment, something thoughtful and quietly proud settling over her features. "You gave her more than justice tonight," Julian said. "You gave an entire family back their freedom." We did, Elara corrected gently. I could not have managed any of it alone, Julian. Whatever courage I found it because you stood beside me while I searched for it. As do I, Julian said, and drew her into a slow turn as the music resumed around them, the two of them moving together through the ballroom, while every eye in the room watched a duke and duchess who had begun their union as strangers, now dance together as something far closer to equals, partners, and, though neither had expected to arrive at the word so completely, in love. Outside the tall windows, the London night stretched dark and quiet over the city, indifferent to the small, hard-won transformation taking place within the ballroom's warm light. But inside, surrounded by the same society that had once dismissed Elara so thoroughly, Julian held his wife close and understood, with a clarity that settled every doubt he had once carried into this marriage, that whatever the world had once believed about the plain, forgettable bride of Edenmere, the truth had always been far different, and far more remarkable, than anyone had ever allowed themselves to see. The rumors that once defined her were gone now, replaced permanently by the truth Julian had been fortunate enough to witness for himself the moment her veil first lifted, and had spent every day since discovering more fully, layer by careful layer, until the woman before him bore no resemblance at all to the stranger he had once resented marrying. She was, simply and entirely, the finest thing that had ever happened to him, and as the music swelled and the ballroom turned around them, Julian Ashworth, Duke of Edenmere, allowed himself, at last, to be exactly as happy as he had once believed himself incapable of becoming. A year had passed since the veil first lifted in that cold stone church, and Edenmere in early autumn looked nothing like the gray, unwelcoming house Elara had first arrived at as a stranger. A year had passed since the veil first lifted in that cold stone church, and Edenmere in early autumn looked nothing like the gray, unwelcoming house Elara had first arrived at as a stranger. The change had not happened all at once. Julian often thought back on the small, quiet moments that had built toward it, the shared breakfasts that grew longer as conversation came easier, the evenings in the library that no longer felt like careful negotiations between two guarded strangers, the slow accumulation of trust that had turned duty into something neither of them had expected to find. He could not point to a single day when the transformation was complete. It had simply happened, the way seasons change, gradual and then suddenly undeniable. Julian stood at the window of his study, watching his wife walk the garden below with a letter in her hand, her steps unhurried, her manner entirely unlike the guarded composure she had once worn as armor. She looked up and caught him watching, a smile breaking easily across her face, and Julian found himself, as he did most mornings now, quietly amazed at how thoroughly his life had changed since the day he resented the very idea of marrying her. He made his way down to join her, the household staff greeting him warmly as he passed, the atmosphere of Edenmere entirely transformed from the cold formality it had once held under his father's rule. Elara had brought something to the house he had not realized it lacked, a warmth that extended from the family rooms all the way down to the kitchens, a sense that the people living and working within these walls mattered as more than simply their function within it. "A letter from Lady Colton," Elara said, holding it up as he approached. "Her sister has become engaged, to a kind man who knew the whole of her history and thought no less of her for it. She writes that she owes much of her courage to face love again, to what happened here last year." "That is good news," Julian said, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench near the roses, the same bench where so much of their story together had first begun to unfold. "It is," Elara agreed. "I find myself thinking of it often, how much changed for so many people because of one difficult year." Lady Colton's sister, the other women Pratt found, my own father, who writes to me now more often than he ever did before, as though he is determined to make up for years of distance in whatever time remains to him. "And you," Julian said, "what has changed most for you?" Elara considered the question seriously, tilting her head as she watched the last of the summer roses swaying gently in the breeze. "Everything," she said finally. "A year ago, I walked into a marriage expecting nothing beyond duty and distance, prepared to spend my life quietly managing a husband's indifference the way I had learned to manage everything else. I did not expect to find a partner. I certainly did not expect to fall in love with the very man rumor had painted as cold and unfeeling before I ever met him." Julian laughed softly at that, taking her hand in his. "Rumor was not entirely wrong about me. In those early days, I gave you every reason to expect exactly that." "You did," Elara agreed, though her smile remained warm rather than accusing. "But you also proved willing to change, once you understood the truth of things. That mattered more than any first impression could have." They sat together a while longer, the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed constant conversation to feel close to each other, before a servant approached from the house, informing them that Lord Whitmore had arrived earlier than expected for his planned visit. They found him in the drawing room, looking better than Julian had seen him in the year since the trial, some of the old worry finally smoothed from his features. He embraced Alara warmly, then turned to Julian with a firm, grateful handshake. "I bring good news," Lord Whitmore said, once they were all settled. "The estate's finances have finally stabilized, thanks in no small part to the connections your marriage brought us, Julian. I no longer fear the future the way I once did." "I am glad to hear it," Julian said. "Though I suspect you give my involvement more credit than it deserves. Alara's courage did more to secure your family's future than any financial arrangement I might have offered." Lord Whitmore's gaze moved to his daughter, something deeply proud in his expression. "She has always had more courage than anyone gave her credit for. I am only sorry it took a scandal, and a very brave duke, to finally let the world see it properly." Margaret arrived just before dinner, unable to resist joining the small family gathering, once word reached her of Lord Whitmore's visit. She settled into the drawing room with the easy familiarity of someone who had watched this marriage transform from a reluctant arrangement into something she now considered among the finest matches she had ever witnessed. "I still remember your face at the wedding, Julian," Margaret said, a teasing warmth in her voice. "Utterly frozen, the moment that veil lifted. I have never seen you so thoroughly caught off guard in all the years I have known you." "I have not lived it down since," Julian said dryly, though he was smiling. "Nor should you," Margaret said. "It is one of my favorite memories of you, if I am honest. The great Duke of Edenmere, undone entirely by a single glance." She turned to Alara, her expression softening. "You have been remarkably good for him, my dear. I do not believe I have seen him this settled since before his father passed." Alara reached for Julian's hand beneath the table, a small, private gesture that spoke more than any words might have.
"He has been remarkably good for me as well,"
she said.
"I do not think either of us expected that, at the start."
"Few of the best things in life announce themselves in advance," Lord Whitmore said, raising his glass slightly. "I am simply grateful, whatever the beginning, that it led you both here." The conversation continued through the afternoon, easy and warm in a way it had never been during those first tense weeks of Julian and Alara's marriage. Lord Whitmore stayed through dinner, and as evening settled over Edenmere, Julian found himself reflecting, not for the first time, on how completely the house and everyone within it had transformed over the course of a single difficult year. Alara's gaze moved to Julian, warmth passing between them in a glance that Margaret and Lord Whitmore both noticed, exchanging a knowing look of their own across the table. "You two still look at each other the way you did that evening at the ball," Margaret observed. "I confess, I did not expect that particular spark to last a full year, let alone grow stronger. Most marriages of convenience settle into comfortable indifference long before now. Ours was never destined for indifference," Alara said. "Not once Julian decided to stop resenting me long enough to actually see me. A decision I have never once regretted," Julian added, earning a soft laugh from the table. Later that night, once Lord Whitmore had retired to the guest quarters prepared for him, Julian found Alara in the library, curled into her favorite chair with a book he did not recognize, exactly as he had found her that first week of their marriage, when he had still been learning the shape of the stranger he had married. "You look thoughtful," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I was thinking of that first evening you found me here," Alara admitted. "You asked why I never corrected the rumors about myself. I remember thinking, at the time, that no one would have believed me, even if I had tried. And now? Now I know precisely how wrong that fear was," Alara said. "Sometimes the truth simply requires the right person willing to stand beside you while you tell it." Julian crossed the small distance between them and knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "I intend to keep standing beside you," he said, "for every truth still left to tell, and every year still left for us to share." Alara set her book aside, her eyes bright with the same quiet warmth that had first begun to soften his resentment all those months ago. "Then I find myself the most fortunate woman in England," she said, "married to a man the rumors got entirely wrong, in every possible way." "As am I," Julian said, "married to a woman the rumors never came close to understanding at all." Outside, the autumn wind moved gently through the roses that had witnessed the beginning of everything between them, and inside, in the warm quiet of the library, Julian Ashworth and his Duchess sat together long into the evening, no longer strangers bound by duty, but partners bound by something far stronger, a love neither had expected to find, built from truth instead of rumor. and strong enough now to weather whatever years still lay ahead of them. In the months that followed that quiet evening, life at Edenmere settled into a rhythm neither Julian nor Alara had dared imagine during those first cold weeks of their marriage. Alara took on a quiet role advising other families who found themselves facing men like Voss, her name becoming, in certain circles, a symbol of what courage and honest testimony could accomplish, against those who relied on silence to protect their cruelty. Julian supported her efforts fully, using his own standing to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed to women, without a duke willing to stand beside them. Their days were not without ordinary troubles, the small disagreements and adjustments that came with any genuine partnership, but even these Julian found himself grateful for, proof that what existed between them now was real, rather than the careful performance of their earliest weeks together. They argued over small things and reconciled over larger ones, learned each other's habits and quiet moods, built together, patiently, the kind of steady life neither had believed possible on the day a veil first lifted in a cold stone church and changed everything neither of them had known they were waiting for. Edenmere, once a house defined by cold obligation and quiet distance, had become, at last, a true home, its halls filled with warmth, its future secured not merely by fortune or title, but by the steady, hard-won love of two people who had learned, together, that the truth, however long it takes to surface, is always worth the waiting.